My name is Leighton Reed. I am an assistant professor in the School of Plant and Environmental Sciences at Virginia Tech, and I'm going to tell you about predicting toucan-mediated seed dispersal in tropical forest restoration. One of the perennial challenges in restoration ecology is to identify the gaps between restored ecosystems and reference ecosystems, and then to develop restoration strategies to overcome those gaps. David Moreno-Mateos and co-authors describe this concept as the recovery debt, that is, the hypervolume of environmental quality parameters that is not yet recovered from a given disturbance. This is a unifying concept for restoration ecology because it clearly defines the goal of the discipline: to discover new and better ways to reduce the gap between our goals for restored ecosystems and the reality of how far we are from reaching those goals. Today I'm going to talk about one aspect of the recovery debt as it relates to tropical forest restoration. Large seeded animal dispersed trees, or LSAD trees, are one of the characteristic guilds in tropical forestry communities. They include some of the rarest and most endangered trees in the tropics, and they're often important carbon reservoirs because they tend to grow slowly and pack on dense wood. Large seeded animal dispersed trees are also very slow to recolonize disturbed post-agricultural forests. There are a few reasons. First, most of these species have recalcitrant seeds, which means that they never become dormant and they never form a seed bank. Second, large seeded trees have limited seed dispersal. Generally, large seeds have to be dispersed by animals with big mouths, and most of the big-mouthed animals are reluctant to leave the forest and travel into the agricultural countryside. Third, large seeded trees are underrepresented in restoration plantings. This is because their seeds are expensive to acquire and to propagate. In the Atlantic forest region in Brazil, for example, we found that the underrepresentation of large seeded animal dispersed trees reduced potential carbon storage in restored forests by 3 to 11%. So what options exist for enriching regenerating forests with large seeded animal dispersed trees? One strategy is to introduce them through direct seeding or planting. The key barrier to this strategy is cost, since large seeded trees are more expensive. A second option involves attracting the dispersal agents. Some large animals, like toucans, hornbills, and fruit bats, are capable of dispersing large seeds over long distances, including across fragmented or deforested landscapes, and depositing viable seeds in regenerating forests. Enhancing seed dispersal by animals like toucans could be done by prioritizing restoration within landscapes where toucans are present, or through local restoration tactics, such as planting fruiting trees and shrubs. All else being equal, attracting frugivores to restoration sites should be a more efficient strategy than seeding or planting, because repeated visits by a toucan would promote sustained colonization events for large seeded trees over time, potentially including species that are rare or fruit sporadically. So that's the approach that we pursued. Our study answers two questions. First, how much does small-scale restoration affect toucan visitation to regenerating forests compared to landscape-scale habitat suitability? We hypothesized that the role of local habitat restoration interventions would be to concentrate toucan activity within suitable habitat at the landscape scale. Second, how well does toucan activity predict large-seeded animal dispersed tree recruitment? In other words, if toucans are attracted to a restoration site, does that make a difference for the diversity of large-seeded trees that establish there? We hypothesized that toucan visitation and habitat suitability would increase the richness of large-seeded tree species recruiting in restoration sites. Our study area was in southern Costa Rica in the Coto-Bruce Valley, an agricultural region that produces primarily coffee and beef. Our study encompassed about 500 square kilometers ranging from 800 to 1,500 meters above sea level. This area is wet. It gets between 3.5 and 4 meters of rain per year. And the main forest types are transitional between rainforest and pre-montane wet forest. 2/3 of the forest in this region was cleared between 1960 and 1980, and today about 1/3 of the landscape is forested. We focused on the 3 extant species of toucan in this area. The emerald toucanet, Allocorhynchus crassinus, is a small toucan that occurs in the higher elevations. The fiery-billed arsari, Pteroglossus francii, is slightly larger at 250 grams and is endemic to southern Costa Rica and western Panama. The chestnut-mandibled toucan, Ramphastos ambiguus, is the largest toucan in this area at 750 grams. In the results, I'll use these icons to represent the 3 species, and I'll always show them in this order, from smallest to largest. We used the experimental infrastructure of the Islas project, a randomized block restoration experiment that was initiated in 2004 by Karen Hole, Zach Zahawi, and Rebecca Cole. This experiment includes 3 restoration treatments applied to quarter-hectare plots of agricultural land, namely cattle pastures. Natural regeneration plots were fenced and allowed to regrow without further intervention. Applied nucleation plots were planted with 6 patches of trees with the expectation that those patches would expand and coalesce over time. Tree plantations had tree seedlings planted throughout the entire 50 by 50 meter area. Planted areas in this diagram are indicated in green. Applied nucleation and plantation treatments used an equivalent planting density of 1,250 trees per hectare, and these plantings included 4 tree species, 2 native species used for timber, Ricisia and Terminalia, and 2 naturalized legumes that are widely used in agroecosystems, Inga and Erythrina. Importantly, none of these species produces fruit eaten by toucans. The Eastlis project is replicated at multiple sites. We chose 11 sites for this study that spanned a deforestation gradient from 13 to 82% forest cover within 1 kilometer. And we used 4 main sources of data. First, we surveyed our 11 restoration sites for toucans 3 times per year from 2010 through 2018. These were the main data that we used to make inferences about the effects of restoration treatments on toucan visitation. Second, we used a set of toucan observations drawn from a survey of bird communities in 55 forest fragments spread across the Cotobruz Valley. These data were used to create habitat suitability models for the 3 toucan species. Third, we used GIS coverages of forest cover and forest age that were based on hand classifying aerial and satellite imagery going back to 1947. This was a key predictor in the habitat suitability models. And finally, we did a complete census of large seeded tree species in 7 tree plantations. In these surveys, we recorded every large seeded tree seedling greater than 20 centimeters in height throughout the entire quarter-hectare plantation. In a nutshell, our analytical approach was first to use maximum entropy modeling to produce habitat suitability models for each toucan species based on our observations from the forest fragments. As predictors, we used elevation, total forest cover within a half a kilometer or a kilometer, and forest age divided into old growth forest and secondary forest. Next, we used general linear models to correlate habitat suitability with our independent observations of toucans in the restoration sites, and then to correlate both habitat suitability and toucan observations with the species richness of large seeded animal dispersed tree seedlings in the 7 plantations. Here's what we discovered. We produced habitat suitability models for the 3 toucans. Here, habitat suitability is indicated by color, with green representing the greatest habitat suitability. Emerald toucanets selected higher elevation habitats, mostly above 1,300 meters. Fiery-billed arsaris selected lower elevation habitats and avoided larger patches of old growth forest. Chestnut-mandible toucans selected extensive forest of any age. These habitat affinities align with what we already know about the natural history of these species. We tested the habitat suitability models by regressing habitat suitability against the independently collected toucan observations from the restoration experiment. The correlations were excellent for the emerald toucanet, quite good for the chestnut-mandible toucan, and pretty poor for the fiery-billed arsari. We think the problem with the arsari model is that the underlying data came exclusively from forest fragments, whereas we know that arsaris often select habitat in non-forest areas. So how did the 3 local restoration treatments affect toucan visitation? Here I'm showing the cumulative number of toucan detections over time for 9 years. Dashed blue lines represent natural regeneration, long dashed pink lines represent applied nucleation, and solid orange lines represent plantations. For all 3 species, toucans visited restoration areas 2 to 6 years sooner and at least 2 times more often when those areas were actively restored by planting trees, particularly in larger plantations. And the most extreme case was the chestnut-mandible toucan, which we only saw in tree plantations and never in the other treatments. As we expected, the number of large-seeded tree species increased with greater number of toucan detections. Here I'm showing data for the chestnut-mandible toucan, whose detections in restoration sites predicted about 44% of the variance in large-seeded tree richness. That's pretty good, but estimated habitat suitability did a little bit better, predicting 85% of the variance in seedling richness, actually nearly twice as much. For the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on the chestnut-mandible toucan here. So toucans were associated not only with greater large-seeded tree species richness, but they also correlated with the presence of more rare large-seeded tree species. 14 out of the 22 large-seeded tree species that we identified were found in fewer than half of our study sites, so they were rare. And out of those, 13 species only occurred in sites with habitat suitability of at least 0.5 for chestnut-mandible toucans. And 7 of those species occurred only in sites with habitat suitability of at least 0.7 for chestnut-mandible toucans. In other words, nearly 2/3 of the large-seeded species were unlocked by having the largest toucan in the study area visit the site. So what have we learned about predicting toucan-mediated seed dispersal? The biggest thing we've learned is that there are 2 relevant spatial scales to consider. At the landscape scale, a scale of hundreds of meters to about a kilometer, the largest toucan in our study area selects habitat that contains a large amount of forest. In more deforested areas, these toucans are rare or absent, and we shouldn't expect them to visit restoration sites. At the local scale, a scale of tens of meters in this study, restoration practitioners can attract toucans by planting trees, but only if the surrounding landscape is already suitable for toucans. Tree planting in our study probably attracted toucans by providing high perches, shade, and food in the form of arthropods and maybe small vertebrates. What our trees did not provide was fruit, and that's an area that should be explored more. As with all studies, our inferences are limited to the area that we worked. Results might not apply in other areas, especially where toucans are persecuted by people, where remnant forest patches are small, or where toucans are not the most important dispersal agents. And finally, there's a big push for large-scale forest and landscape restoration. It's being advanced by actors at international to subnational scales to fight climate change, prevent biodiversity loss, and increase natural capital. And an important take-home message from this study is that large-scale reforestation has the potential to increase habitat suitability for wide-ranging seed dispersers like toucans. This is a powerful idea because restoring habitat for toucans at a landscape scale could boost the overall resilience of large seeded tree populations. But that vision is contingent on there being enough large seeded trees present in the new forests that are being established right now. This work would not have been possible without support from dedicated students, field technicians, homestay hosts, field station staff, and landowners. We also gratefully acknowledge financial support from our sponsors. If you have questions or comments about this work, you can tweet at me at Leighton Reed or send me an email at jlreed@vt.edu. You can also find me on the web at restorationecologylab.com or on my blog, Natural History of Ecological Restoration. Vive los tucanes!